What's going on, Packers fans? Happy Friday. Welcome into an all-new episode of the Pack-A-Day Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. You can find the podcast at Pack-A-Day Podcast. Hope you're getting ready for a unbelievably epic weekend. Today, we're going to be going over a much discussed, much talked about topic. Jaire Alexander, yes, I understand the oxygen has been taken up by this entire story, not only from a podcasting standpoint, from a digital print standpoint, from a print standpoint. It has been all Jaire Alexander all the time, but that's sort of the crux of today's episode. There has been a million different turns and twists in this entire story, and we're going to go over that today and kind of go through the entire timeline of the Jaire Alexander situation, where we stand today, and just kind of updating everyone. There's a reason why I want to go over that, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we get into our main topic, shout out to Jeff Martins for becoming an all-new Pack-A-Day Podcast YouTube member. If you haven't checked it out yet, make sure to check out those memberships. A lot of great stuff out there. The big thing is the extra Q&A every single week. You get to ask the questions. I usually get to every single question in those live Q&As. This past week, we had Justice Mosqueda on. You never quite know who's going to show up. So make sure to sign up for those memberships if you get the chance. If you can't, no worries, no stress, no pressure, whatever. Everyone's welcome, and I just always appreciate your support. If you can, like, subscribe, comment, give those 5-star reviews, and tell a friend. We always appreciate that as well. Packers did make one transaction on Thursday. Wide receiver Sam Brown. This was a player that a lot of people expected was going to be a late round draft choice, and a player that a lot of people expected the Packers to have interest in later in the draft. He is very much a Packers type. When we go back to the Green Bay draft guide that Ross Uglum and Jacob Morley, Jacob Westendorf, etc., worked on, he was one of those kind of tier one type of Packers that very much fits what Green Bay likes at the position. And he's just chilling out there. And Green Bay said, yeah, we're interested. Do they probably need another wide receiver on their roster right now? No, they probably do not. They're pretty stacked, and it's got to be the single toughest position to try to figure out and find a way to make a roster spot, right? Not only do you have 5 lead pipe locks to make the team, you have Christian Watson coming back at some point, which is a 6th. And even if you do keep an additional receiver, you've got Malik Heath and Bo Melton, McCole Hardman trying to battle it out for maybe one spot. But this isn't about that. This is just getting good football players on your team. And Sam Brown will be fighting to try to find and claw his way onto a practice squad spot. But he's a very talented player, 6'2", 202, 9.91 relative athletic score, a 99th percentile athlete at the position, 4.44 40-yard dash, 14.1 yards per catch this past year, was a all Big 12 honorable mention in the past. And what I will mention as well is he did play with Matthew Golden at Houston. So that is a little bit noteworthy as well. In order to make room for Sam Brown, the Packers waived injured defensive end Jeremiah Martin. Remember, he did not practice at OTAs the other day. He is now off the team. He will clear waivers. He will go back to the roster on the injured list, and then the Packers will release him with an injury settlement. It probably amounts to nothing because it's probably something that he's back in a few weeks. So there's probably not much of a settlement there, but just kind of note that that'll be the process that it goes through. Disappointing, I'm sure, for Martin, where it's worth noting here. I should say that, these players, if you're an undrafted free agent, if you are a fringe, like very fringe back of the roster guy, if you come in and you suffer any injury whatsoever, it's just an entire death blow to your chances of making the team. Like, you are so far behind the 8 ball even to begin with. And then if you get any sort of injury, it just makes things so insanely tough. And so I feel for Jeremiah Martin. Hopefully, pops back and finds an opportunity somewhere else. But for now, he is released. And again, the Packers pick up wide receiver Sam Brown. If you have the chance to check out the highlights and just the speed, some of the run after catch stuff, it's really, really good, but highly recommend doing that. But again, he will fight his way to try to find a practice squad spot. Meanwhile, one Marcedes Lewis was interviewed by Kay Adams, who has interviewed a variety of Packers and former Packers this offseason. She does such an incredible job, of course. And she talked to Marcedes about, potentially returning to Green Bay, being a Packer. Marcedes wants to play one more year to complete 20 years in the NFL, which is just unbelievable. Already, played 19 years and still a very, very good blocker, both in the run game and in the pass game. Still arguably one of the best blocking tight ends in football. He's still out there. He's still a free agent. And again, Kay asked him about playing in Green Bay. He said, it's interesting. Recently FaceTime with Matt LaFleur. Made it seem and sort of insinuated that, Matt LaFleur would be interested in having him back, but said it's kind of out of his hands. the jump to conclusion that you make here is that LaFleur is cool with bringing him back, but it sounds like maybe Goody and friends would not be. Here's how I see this. I love Marcedes Lewis. One of my, since I started grading tape, one of my favorite players to get, fire up on the all 22 and grade every single week. The attention to detail, the skill, the craft, all of it is just incredible. What I will say is the days of Marcedes Lewis being a tight end are over. And I'm not saying he can't play in the NFL. I hope and think he can still play this upcoming season. He's an offensive lineman. He's not a backup offensive lineman. He's a sixth offensive lineman when he's out on the field. Maybe, and I mean maybe, you can sneak him out for a pass. Even some of those plays where they, sort of disguised it well and got him out and teams weren't expecting it, those would go for like 8 or 9 yards. And that's no disrespect to Marcedes. That's just not part of his game anymore. He is an unbelievable blocker. What you can probably get by with if you're Green Bay without signing Marcedes Lewis is just going with a sixth offensive lineman. They've got 7 of them that are capable. If I'm Green Bay, do I really need to roster Marcedes Lewis as a quote unquote tight end when I can just put Anthony Belton in and have him be my sixth offensive lineman and have him go out and move some people? Because Anthony Belton probably has as good of a chance of breaking a 20-yard reception as Marcedes Lewis does. He's just not a receiver anymore. He's a true blocker. And Green Bay has a variety of those on the roster already. I don't think you're fooling anyone just because he's wearing number 89 and is out there on the field. Again, can you do something in the red zone where he, again, slips out and you can do it? Sure, absolutely. But I don't know that the value is there. Now, you could make an argument of like, hey, if he's willing to take a vet minimum, like no signing bonus, like couldn't you just bring him in? Sure, if he's open to that. He's had a pretty standard like $2 to $3 million contract with a certain signing bonus for a while now. But if he's willing to come in for a 1-year vet minimum, you would certainly entertain that. Like, why would you not? You risk the chance as Marcedes Lewis that you get cut at the end of camp if Green Bay wants to go in that direction and keep another player somewhere else and then just go with an extra offensive lineman. But if you want to discuss like, hey, wouldn't Marcedes Lewis be a better option than Johnny Lumpkin at tight end? Yeah, he probably would. It would probably be a better way to go. But here's the thing. When you sign Marcedes Lewis to the 90-man roster, what's going to happen? The team's going to fall in love with him. He's going to have that leadership role in the team. These are all very positive things, by the way. But Goody knows you get him on the 90-man and you're just giving him a spot on the 53. He's going to be very difficult to cut. He's Marcedes freaking Lewis. He's, again, one of those leaders. The locker room's going to love him. And if you get to the end of camp and then you're like, oh, we need to release Marcedes, and then you realize that that's going to maybe be a little bit of an issue in the locker room because everyone loves this guy, you basically might end up having to keep him. And I'll listen to the argument and just be like, so what? Keep him anyway. He's an unbelievable leader in the locker room. And like, what are we going to be worried and lose sleep over, Ben Sims in year 3 or John Fitzpatrick or anything like that? Just bring in Marcedes for year 3. I'll say that fine, sure. Why not go ahead and do it? But I understand why maybe Goody and company do not want to go in that direction because, again, the age, the potential injury risk at that age, no real pass catching ability. I'm not saying he can't catch the ball, but like there's no threat as a receiver or pass catcher, and you're basically just rostering another lineman, which you have plenty of those on the team already. So I'm if you want to do it, fine. It's no issue. I'm not worried about cutting some of those backup tight ends to keep him. You could certainly do it, but I can also understand why maybe Goody is just like, we're good as is. It doesn't really add anything of value, but I would love his leadership in that locker room. That's something that you can never have enough of. And getting Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave, who are still young in their career, to get mentored by Marcedes Lewis for a year, there's worse things in the world than that happening. So I don't see it happening. Don't expect it to happen. But if they did go ahead and do it, I'm totally cool with it. And it would be wonderful to have Marcedes back in that locker room. That brings us to our main topic for today, and that is the entire Jaire Alexander timeline from beginning to end. The other day, I wrote this whole article up for PackerReport.com. That may not seem like anything on the surface. I don't write articles. I do write the Grading the Pack article during the season every single week over on Packer Report. That's pretty much all I do. I would prefer to talk to you guys. I do a live podcast, do a recorded podcast. It's just, I enjoy it a whole heck of a lot more, which I never really expected when I first got into this. I enjoyed writing. I didn't have any real aspirations of getting in front of a camera or, going and starting a podcast when I very first started, but it just evolved into I enjoy doing this a whole heck of a lot more. And the writing side it's fine. I don't mind doing an article every now and again or whatever, but I would just usually rather get on a show and do this. But I had the idea the other night of like, hey, I want to look at this entire timeline. There's a couple reasons. One, I can't stand, just being totally transparent, this narrative that's out there that guys like Tom Silverstein, Rob Domofsky, Matt Schneidman, all like that there's been this narrative of the beat writers against Jaire Alexander. I want to be clear on something, because I will online and in Twitter and whatever get grouped in with Packers beat writers. And I think you have to be very, very careful with how you group people together in this situation. I do not consider myself a beat writer. I am credentialed. I go to practices, and maybe during like training camp, you could maybe consider me in that realm during training camp in and of itself. But these guys are with the team all year long. They have like resources, they have sources, they have agents that they talk to, they have team sources that they talk to, they have players that they talk to. They're in the locker room constantly. That is a different job description altogether than what I do. I'm a podcaster. I go on YouTube. I'm an analyst, but I'm not a beat guy. And I've seen guys like Schneidman and Domofsky and Silverstein and these others get thrown under the bus because of my 0.01% statement. And we'll get into that as well. And it's not fair to them in that situation. And they'll just say all the beat writers are against them. And even again, for me, I'm not against Jaire Alexander. I've gone over this. I've done a whole episode on it of like, hey, here's the case for bringing Jaire Alexander back. I wouldn't do it personally, but at the time, like that was the case that you could make. And I understood it if they would have done it. No question about it. And I've said all along, the best possible scenario here for Jaire is that he's back and he's healthy. If he's back and he's healthy, I don't care if you're paying him 17, 18 million per year. If he's back and he's healthy, that's a worthwhile investment. I don't know that you can trust that that's going to be the outcome because of all the games that he's missed, but that is by far and away the best possible outcome of this entire situation. So the reason that I wanted to do this is twofold. One, because I wanted to go back and look at this of like, where is this narrative come from that the beat guys are out there and there's this narrative against Jaire Alexander and everyone's trying to get him cut or traded or gone. I have, I've done stuff outside of the Packers with guys like Paul Brettel, Wes Hodkiewicz. I've been to like a Cheesehead TV party where Rob and some of those guys have been there, but like I'm not going to bat with them because I feel like I need to have their back. I can tell you guys wholeheartedly that if you think Rob for a second gives one flying, what, if Jaire Alexander stays or goes, he could care less. He could absolutely care less. And if anything, as Matt Schneidman said on Cheesehead TV the other day, like Jaire's a great interview. Like that is a guy as a beat writer, like you want in that locker room, because when he does talk, he is very forthcoming, very interesting. And, you're going to get some great quotes, some great content, some great videos, all of it from Jaire. You want him in that locker room. And for those guys specifically, like they're in it for the story. Like the best thing that they can have is guys that can generate content and stories and everything like that. Like he's gold. He's absolutely gold. So this idea that Rob or Matt or Tom or any of these guys want Jaire Alexander out or have done anything like this or have made up stories or it's not only like comically stupid, but I don't understand it. Then the funny thing is there's this group of people that are like, again, throwing, whomever under the bus. The reports that they're now trusting that Jaire Alexander could be back are the same people. Rob was the first one that had the report that, hey, Jaire may now be back. That there's the potential that they could reconcile this. So you're willing to trust that from Rob, but not the other stuff that happened earlier. It's just the whole thing is ridiculous to me. And I think there's learning points for everyone in this entire situation and scenario, myself included. we'll get to the 0.01% thing eventually. It's not the whole thing that I wanted to talk about today. It's not the crux of the conversation. I don't care. Like, guys, I'll take the L on that in and of itself and just say, when I tweeted that, so my producer Tommy tweeted, "What are the odds that Jaire?" And tweeted at me, "What are the odds Jaire Alexander is going to be back with the Packers this year after the draft had taken place?" And we'll get to why I still felt this way at the time as we kind of go through this today. But I, without even thinking, there was no semblance of thought in my mind. It was more of just like I wholeheartedly felt that the odds that Jaire would come back were remarkably slim. Whether it was 0.01 or anything like that, the 0.01 was said in like I just threw it out there. I didn't put any thought into it whatsoever. Other than, again, I will readily admit to the fact that I really, 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 really did not believe he was going to come back. And the funny thing of this entire thing is we still don't know if he is going to or not. I'm taking the L because very clearly there is a much better chance than I ever gave it credit for at that point in time that he would be back. And I see like, oh, it's just pivoting, or guys, I will take the L every single time when I am deserving of it. The funny thing is last year at this time, and I joked with Aaron Nagler about this on Twitter as well. Last year at this, or not at this time, but earlier, I tweeted out, put it in blood, get it tattooed. Aaron Jones will be a Packer in 2024. He wasn't. Spoiler alert. He was a Minnesota Viking in 2024. This is going to happen. I will be wrong. I've been wrong before. I will be wrong again. And maybe it ends up that Jaire is back with the team this year, and maybe it ends up that he's not. Either way, I will wholeheartedly say I probably could have handled that in a different way than tweeting 0.01%, and I'll try to be better on that moving forward. But based on everything we knew at that time, I unequivocally did not think that he would be back. Then we'll go through all the tea leaves that were there at that point in time. Based on what we knew, based on every shred of evidence at that time, I really didn't believe it. And I'm still like, I don't know. I have no idea what happens at this point. It's a true 50-50 coin flip for me right now. So if you want me to put another percentage on it, it's 50%. But the reason I wanted to, again, go over this in its entirety is to see why was I so confident at that point in time that he would not be back? What led me to that point? And then the other thing I wanted to go through is, was there this feeling that the Packers beat, or whatever it might be considered, was against Jaire, or that there was some real mistake along the way that was made? I wanted to check it because I'm like, what has been, why does this part of it exist? So I did it. I went at 11 p.m. at night for no reason whatsoever, and I put together this entire timeline. It took me way longer than I expected it. You can find it on PackerReport.com. And it has all the links to the articles that have been out there, the tweets that have been out there this entire time. But we're going to go through it today. And I think it's really interesting to kind of look back at. And as I wanted to also do this episode before we have a resolution, because if it's a resolution where he comes back, it's like, oh, he's just doing it because he was wrong and now he wants it. No, again, I'll take the L on it. I'm not afraid of, I'm going to be wrong so many freaking times when doing this. I called John Fitzpatrick yesterday, Ryan Fitzpatrick. These things are going to happen. I'm not always going to be right. And I think the more that you can admit that and say, hey, there's going to be mistakes along the way as I do this, as I try to cover the team 365 days a year, I think that you can't take yourself too seriously, or know that those things are going to happen from time to time. And again, if he ends up, here's the other thing I'll just add onto this before we get into it. If he ends up where he's not back with the team, there's no victory lap for me. I'm not going to be going like, ha, told you so. This is clearly meandered all throughout to the point where there have been different percentage points throughout. And that's what I think is so, like, when people want to force people to say they were wrong, and okay, sure, fine, whatever. But the truth of the matter is this has been evolving the entire time. When the offseason started, and we'll talk about this as well, I really did not think Jaire was going to be back before we even heard any tea leaves of anything, because the contract predicated that it was unlikely that it was going to be back. The previous relationship issues, the suspension, all of that stuff, to me predicated, I would have almost told you 0.01 before we even heard of any potential trade rumors or anything like that. Like, I really did not think so even at that point. And then you get to all the stuff that we're about to go through, and you can see very clearly why you could come to the conclusion that he's not going to be back. And then as of late, we've got these different sort of stories and reports that have come out that the Packers have made offers to Jaire, that have sort of tried to restructure his contract or renegotiate his contract, that Jaire wants to be a Packer. That's going to change your thoughts on some of that. No question about it. So this has been a story that has progressed over time. This has been a journey that has progressed over time. And I totally believe, from a Packers point of view, if you would have told them that they were at this point right now where they tried to trade Jaire, couldn't get anything for him, or at least figure out a deal that made sense for all sides and all parties, and now we're at the point of a potential reconciliation, I don't think they really would have believed you. And again, maybe that's not even the case. Maybe they still have no delusions that he's going to be on the team. But it definitely, no matter what way you slice it, today, as I'm recording this, very early in the morning on May 30th, Friday, May 30th, it clearly is seemingly a much better chance today that he's back on the team than he was at any point really earlier in the offseason. So it's an evolving story. And this idea that, oh, the beat guys were just wrong with their reports previously. No, these reports have been, corroborated by numerous sources, both nationally and locally, by different organizations that don't, work together, by, PackersNews.com, by ESPN, by, again, national sources, Ian Rappaport. We're going to go again through this step by step, but this was not some joint effort. We didn't, as anyone that's, credentialed media members and national, we didn't have a Zoom meeting and be like, all right, how can we screw over Jaire Alexander here? Like, how can we get him out of Green Bay? I know we'll have a joint effort by everyone involved, nationally, locally, the people that are podcasters. We're all going to get in on this together. It's just stupid. All right. So here's the whole story from beginning to end. Obviously, Jaire Alexander was Brian Gutekunst's very first draft pick. Had the early pick, moved down, moved back up. We know the story, picked up an extra first rounder, gave up a third rounder, picked up, Darnell Savage the following year by being able to do that. And then, moved back up, picked Jaire Alexander. Again, Brian Gutekunst as a general manager, his very first ever draft pick. Has a great career. It's trending in all of the right directions. It looks like he's going to be a force to be reckoned with at corner, and probably a consistent all-pro caliber corner for the Packers. Then 2021 comes along, injures his shoulder, misses 13 games that year due to his shoulder injury. I've talked about this in the past with Jaire. His grade for me prior to that shoulder injury was monumental. Just a huge, huge, huge grade. Post shoulder injury that year in 2021 till now has been basically net neutral, a very slight positive. It has been night and day the difference that Jaire Alexander, the player, has been pre that injury and post that injury. And of course, ever since that point, has missed a ton of games as well with a variety of injuries. So 2021, 13 games missed due to the shoulder injury. May 16th of 2022, the Packers said, we don't care. We don't care about that shoulder injury. We're giving you a 4-year, $84 million contract, a record-setting contract at the time, and $21 million per year. A big-time investment into Jaire Alexander. In 2022, Jaire played almost the entirety of the season, missed week 4 with a groin injury. Then in 2023, Jaire would miss 3 games due to a back injury and 6 games due to a shoulder injury. And then December 24th, 2023, in Carolina, Jaire Alexander anointed himself captain prior to the game and took his place with the captains prior to the coin toss, which of course was a little bit frowned upon. On December 27th, the Packers suspended Jaire Alexander 1 game due to conduct detrimental to the team. A couple notes here. The reports have indicated that that this was not just a one-time one-off that they were suspending him for, that there had been a variety of different things that had taken place that had culminated in Jaire going off for the coin toss. And that was what got him suspended. It wasn't just the coin toss. It was a series of events that led up to that. And Green Bay felt like they had to sort of rein it in, and therefore the 1-game suspension. And what I'll say on top of that as well is I thought the Packers and Jaire Alexander handled that as best as they possibly could. I thought Jaire Alexander did a phenomenal job in really kind of changing his approach, especially for the rest of that season, and really taking ownership of the situation and saying he needed to be better. It felt like he really grew from that entire scenario and situation and suspension. And it felt like the Packers also gained a better understanding of how they had to have some of these interpersonal relationships. And they probably missed the boat not making him captain in his hometown. And just, it seemed like they had maybe a little bit more of an open door policy from there on. Like, I thought both sides really grew from that situation. And Jaire didn't have to do it. He's a star. He just got a record setting contract. He could have said, screw you guys, trade me in the offseason. I'm out. Get me anywhere else. I don't want to be here anymore. You guys suspended me. You embarrassed me. You didn't let me be team captain. Like, he could have gone nuclear on that thing. And instead of pointing fingers and blaming the Packers, he reflected on it and found ways that he could be better personally. I love that from Jaire. I love that for the Packers. I thought they both handled that about as well as they possibly could have given the circumstances. The 2023 season's over. Then we get to 2024. And the season started not great because Jaire had a really tough game against Philadelphia and AJ Brown. But then after that, he was playing really good football and things had really been trending in the right direction in the locker room, right? There was a post-game celebration on one of their wins, and Jaire was the one that broke down the team after the big win. And he seemed to be in somewhat of a leadership role within that locker room, or at minimum, a player that was, again, everyone very much enjoyed being there. And everything seemed to be trending in the right direction. Then we get to the Jacksonville game in week 8, and Jaire Alexander injures his PCL on the final play of the game. And of course, this would cause a variety of issues from an injury standpoint through the rest of the season. And you had Jaire then stay in Green Bay during the bye week, rehab everything, try to get back so he can play with the team. And on November 17th, week 11, Jaire would return against the Chicago Bears, play 10 snaps in that game, re-aggravate the injury, not be able to make it through the game. And that would be the last 10 snaps that he played in the entirety of the season. And depending on what happens, maybe the last 10 snaps that Jaire plays as a member of the Green Bay Packers. Now, the report and Matt Schneidman put an article out on November 21st talking to Jaire Alexander. It's a phenomenal article over on The Athletic that I highly recommend you checking out, because he talked with Jaire and got the whole story. And Jaire did everything he could to return from that injury. They brought him back early. It was probably a mistake on Jaire's part. It was probably a mistake by the Packers to bring him back in that game. It aggravated the injury, and it basically kind of caused him to miss the rest of the season rather than maybe being a little bit more patient with it. I love that Jai wanted to be back in that situation. I love that he wanted to be out there with his team. But then you get into this weird scenario for the rest of the year where he was practicing, even at times being a full participant, and it looked like Jaire was going to come back and then he'd be inactive for the game. And you could tell, and we're going to get to some of those reports a little bit later, that there was some real frustration. And this is one of those ultimate gray areas between player and team and just in the NFL in general. It is a mandatory requirement in the NFL. It is part of the job description that you play hurt. You should never play injured. If you're hurt, everyone's hurt. Everyone in the NFL is banged up in some real way. If you're going to go through pain, it's part of the gig. Like, it's, again, part of the job description of being an NFL player. Everyone's in hurting in some way, shape, or form, and you got to be able to fight through that. If you are injured, meaning you cannot go, or it's going to have a really poor effect on how you can play, and or there's a massive risk of re-aggravation or injury in another body part, whatever that might be, you should not play when you're injured. But that line between injured and hurt is incredibly thin and incredibly vague. And you end up sometimes in these scenarios where the player's like, I'm injured. And the team and the doctors are saying, no, you're hurt. And we need you to go out there and play. And I'm not saying it's exactly this in the situation, but the player is then saying, no, I'm not. I'm not going out there and risking this. And the team's like, no, you should be out there. The doctor cleared you. You need to go out there. And you end up in, again, this awful gray area. And I'm not saying that's the exact scenario that happened here, but there definitely seemed to be frustrations on both sides with Jaire and the Packers as to whether or not he could play. Ultimately, he did not play. He ends up having surgery on December 31st for that PCL injury, and again, does not play for the rest of the season. January 12th, the Packers lose to the Eagles 22-10 in the wildcard game, ending their season. And then on January 13th was locker room cleanouts. And as I mentioned before, just before we even get to the rest of this and where we start putting the breadcrumbs together and the pieces together, the contract in and of itself set to make $17.5 million in additional salary this year. That's non-guaranteed that the Packers can get off of. It's a team option basically for Green Bay. There was 0% chance, in my opinion. Yes, I'm doing percentages again here. 0.0% chance that Jaire would be back on that contract. And I still believe that to be the case. No matter what happens, the one thing I would be most shocked or stunned by would be him coming back and just playing on the contract as is. I would be stunned, beyond stunned, if that were the case, because of all the time that he's missed. And it just gets very complicated. And then you get into the situation. All right, so what does that mean? Jaire probably doesn't want to take a pay cut, which we've kind of seen, right? And I think Jaire is probably in a place where he's just like, hey, you don't want to pay me that, then probably cut me. And there maybe would have been trade value, and we'll get through that in just a moment as well. But before we even get to, again, some of these things starting to come together, it was very clear and obvious that something was going to have to give here, because the contract as is, with Jaire with the injury issues, with some angst and frustration on both sides, was just never going to meld together into just keeping things status quo. There was always going to be some change in the, maybe just again as a restructure. That's fine. That could end up happening still, but there was going to have to be something that gave there, because it was not going to continue as is. And to me, again, just looking at it from the lens of the contract, the player, all the other stuff, even going into it, I'm like, I don't think there's going to be any real chance that Jaire is probably back with the team in 2025. Then we get to that locker room cleanout. Jaire declines to interview or be part of the, scrum and answer questions. He said he has nothing good to say and doesn't know if he's going to be back with the team. And so that's like our first sign of like, all right, Ja's, frustrated. And, there's some real question as to whether he even wants to be back with the team and whether he will be back with the team. And then meanwhile, maybe something, maybe nothing. Keyshawn Nixon on locker room cleanout day is clearly saying he wants to be the number one corner for the Packers. Now, he may, if there was no Jaire situation whatsoever and Jaire was still on the team, maybe he would have said that anyway. Knowing Keyshawn, that's well within the realm of possibility. But maybe it was that he knew that, hey, Jaire's probably gone, and he's starting to put his claim out there to be like, I want to be the guy. If Jaire's gone, I want to be the guy. You can be your own judge, jury, and executioner on that one as to whether or not, Keyshawn kind of knew at that point that there was a real chance that Jaire could be gone, or if that was just Keyshawn, again, being Keyshawn. But he's openly opining and lobbying for the number one position at corner in Green Bay. All right, January 16th is our next update. Brian Gutekunst's end of season press conference says, quote, I know it's been really, really frustrating for not only him as a player, but us as a club. When you have a player who's done what he's done for us in the past and then not being able to get him out on the field consistently, that's tough. It's tough on the player, tough on the organization. We're at the beginning stages of just kind of gathering information as a whole before we start looking at next year and how we're going to lay this thing out. But we could pay him in sort of parentheses, meaning that's the kind of the question that was asked ahead of time. But we could pay him. I mean, obviously, when he's healthy and he's ready to play, he's a pretty good player. And what I was pointing out here is, when asked about Jaire and whether or not he'd be back and whether or not they'd want to pay him this upcoming season, what he was meant to be paid or set to be paid, Goody kind of came back and said, we're just kind of gathering information as a whole before we start looking at next year and how we're going to lay this thing out. When asked about Brandon McManus, who is an unrestricted free agent, he was glowing. Of course, we want Brandon McManus back. And obviously, I'm saying this or paraphrasing this a little bit for Goody here, but he was glowing about wanting Brandon McManus back. McManus was an unrestricted free agent. Jaire was 2 years left on his contract on the team, on the roster. So to hear, yeah, we would love McManus back. It was also glowing about Quay Walker and those sort of things. Then to get to Jaire and say, well, we're still working through this and, going through these conversations and going through and figuring out what we want to do. It was a night and day difference where it led you to believe, all right, there's something there that they are going to have to figure out here, because it's clear they don't necessarily want him on the contract that he's on right now. January 16th, Matt Schneidman wrote an article on Brian Gutekunst's press conference. And in that article said, quote, it's hard to see cornerback Jaire Alexander returning to the Packers. So we're starting to gain a little bit of steam here with some of the beat guys and Schneidman saying, hey, it's hard to see him potentially coming back. What Schneidman did a great job on Cheesehead TV reporting, by the way, is you also have to know that there are differences between reported articles and articles that are, just that, like more like opinion pieces. This was what seemingly in this situation was a piece of opinion from Matt saying it's hard to see corner Jaire Alexander returning to the Packers. He's not saying, per a source within the organization, Jaire Alexander is not going to be back, or per a source close to Jaire's not going to, or per multiple sources, whatever. This is Matt saying it's hard to see a situation in which Jaire Alexander returns to the team. All right, but that was on January 16th, again, following Goody's press conference. He gleaned the same thing that I did, that there was something off in the way that, Jaire was being talked about by Goody. And then again, looking at the contract, the scenario, everything like that. February 5th on Radio Row. Again, take this for what it's worth. It's not necessarily a huge connective piece here, but Josh Jacobs went on Radio Row and said, I think we need another defensive end. I think we need another defensive back. I think we need a wide receiver, a real number one wide receiver. We can put the wide receiver and defensive end ones to the side. It's a different topic for a different day, but he mentions a defensive back. I can tell you wholeheartedly, he did not mean safety. I think he's probably pretty good with the safety room as it is. He's saying, we need another corner. Is that because he was expecting Jaire to be gone? Or again, would he have said that no matter what? He probably says it no matter what, if I'm being honest. Even if Jaire was back, they did not have Nate Hobbs at that time. Eric Stokes was probably on his way out. It was probably basically Jaire and Valentine. And yeah, you're probably thinking, we could use one more guy there. So I don't think it's necessarily a huge relation here. But if he did know that the likelihood was Jaire, that Jaire was going to be gone, then that would make even more sense as to why he's going out and saying, hey, we need another defensive back on the team. On February 15th, Rob Demovsky posted an article about the Packers pending free agents. And in that article said, quote, there are strong indications that Alexander's time with the Packers will end without him playing another down. Multiple team sources have privately expressed their frustration with Alexander's inability to stay healthy and or play through injuries. So the report from Rob here is that strong indicators that Alexander's time with the Packers will end without him playing another down, and that there is frustration within the Packers with his inability to stay healthy and play through injuries. That's pretty noteworthy. This is, again, our first reported sign that Alexander's time is likely coming to an end and that he will not play with the Packers, and that the Packers have some real frustration with his inability to stay healthy and actually get out on the field. On February 25th, we had another Brian Gutekunst press conference, and he was talking about Jaire returning potentially to the Packers. Said, quote, we'll see. We're working through that. He certainly could be, but I think we'll work through that as we go. We've got to get him out there now. I think obviously we've talked about there's been a lot of frustration on his part. He wants to be out there badly, and not being able to be out there at his best has frustrated him. And that has frustrated our football team too, because we're better with him, but we'll see. I think he loves Green Bay. He's always got a lot of energy when he's in the building, and I think he's still around. So we'll work through that as we go through the offseason and see where that leads. The very non-committal from Goody on February 25th. One day later, February 26th, Ian Rappaport tweets, sources, the Packers have had trade conversations centered around star cornerback Jaire Alexander, and they are open to moving him for the right price. Alexander, still just 28 and a two-time Pro Bowler, is considered to be the most decorated cornerback available. On February 26th, a little bit later, Rob Demovsky writes an article about those trade offers and the Packers listening, said, quote, it basically reiterated that there were strong indicators that Alexander's time in Green Bay could be over, that there was frustrations again with the playing through injuries. And he, kind of updated his article and basically said the same thing, that the Packers are open to trading him. Tom Silverstein, PackersNews.com and JS Online, February 26th, writes his article and says in that article, quote, the Green Bay Packers breakup with Jaire Alexander is coming, and only a crisis at the team's cornerback position could result in a change of heart. A source familiar with the talks Tuesday between the Packers and Alexander's agent, John Thornton, said the Packers didn't rule out a return, but gave the impression they're moving on. The Packers didn't bother to ask for a pay cut because they know Alexander wouldn't accept it. So again, barring a crisis at the cornerback position, the Packers are moving on from Jaire Alexander. And a source familiar with the talks said the Packers didn't rule out a return, but gave the impression that they're moving on. That was, again, per Alexander's agent, that the impression was that they were going to go in a different direction. And again, the Packers did not offer a pay cut because they knew Alexander would not accept it. On March 3rd, Jordan Schultz has an article, and in that article says, quote, meanwhile, two-time All-Pro Jaire Alexander is available via trade, although most executives believe the Packers will ultimately release him. There's a national writer that has sources with executives that believe the Packers are going to ultimately release the corner. On March 10th, the Packers agreed to terms with Nate Hobbs. On March 11th, Eric Stokes leaves for the Raiders. On March 13th, Jaire Alexander congratulates Nate Hobbs on becoming a Packer. On March 14th, Corey Ballantyne signs with the Colts. And on March 17th, Rob Domofsky has another update on Jaire. Quote, while Alexander remains on the roster, the Packers are still trying to trade him, according to team sources and a source close to the player. They could wait indefinitely, but most likely would prefer to get something done before next month's draft. One source said the team has not approached Alexander about taking a pay cut, and that even if it did, he would not be willing to do so. Without a trading partner, the Packers would likely release him, but there is no urgency to do so because he has no guaranteed money left on his deal until the start of the regular season when he's due $17.5 million. On March 31st, Brian Gutekunst talked about Jaire again, said, quote, John Thornton, who's his agent, we talk weekly about these things and working together on finding the best solution for everybody. We invested a lot in Jaire, and we want to make sure that if he's not going to be on our football team, helping us win games, that we can get something back for that investment. So we'll see where this goes. March 31st, Matt Schneidman writes an article about this and said, quote, Gutekunst was asked about Alexander potentially being on the team for the 2025 season and said, it could be a possibility, absolutely. But again, I think we're in the middle of that right now, while adding that he's hopeful for a resolution before next month's draft. Then comes April 2nd, and Xavier McKinney posts an Instagram video of him and Jaire Alexander working out together. There's still clearly some connective tissue between either at least the Packers players and Jaire Alexander with the Packers in some capacity. April 15th, Tom Silverstein provides an update on Jaire Alexander. Quote, according to two league sources monitoring Alexander's situation, the Packers have received interest in a trade and remain committed to waiting for a deal to be made instead of cutting him. A source said the Packers appeared close to making a deal at the start of free agency, but the combination of the trade compensation and Alexander's unwillingness to cut his salary to fit the other team's salary cap have made it difficult to close a deal. There has been additional interest since the combine, but teams appear willing to wait until the Packers decide they are going to cut Alexander. Since most of the league knows that the Packers don't intend to keep Alexander, they aren't hurrying to make a deal, figuring he eventually will be cut. On April 16th, a day later, Matt Schneidman has an article, and in that article says, quote, but if Alexander remains on the roster through the draft, Gutekunst might give up on trading him since any draft compensation he'd recoup would be for 2026. Then on April 19th, Jordan Love goes on Up and Adams with Kay Adams and says he's definitely a player we need back, and also says that's a guy we need to have around. So Jordan Love, stumping for his corner and wants him back in Green Bay. On April 21st, Jaire Alexander takes part in the virtual offseason meetings with the Packers. And then later on April 21st, Brian Gutekunst is asked again about Jaire Alexander in his pre-draft press conference and said, quote, we'll see how the draft goes and then see where we are at that point. This is probably one quote, if I'm being honest, that I probably should have put a little bit more stock into in hindsight. We'll see how the draft goes and then where we are at that point. That to me is telling me, hey, we want to see, can we trade him during the draft? Can we get maybe a couple corners? And if not, we might have to revisit some things. That's probably one where I probably could have done a little bit better job of understanding maybe what Goody could have meant with that quote at that point in time, because that's a little bit of an interesting one. On April 25th, Josh Jacobs discussed Jaire Alexander on the Up and Adams show. He said he was one of the very best cornerbacks in the NFL. However, there was a point in that conversation, and I'm just hypothesizing here, okay? This is not one that we need to, put as canon or anything like that. Just my pure hypothesis. If you go and listen to it, there's a point in the interview where he says, whoever, and the insinuation, or at least how I gleaned it, was he was about to say whoever gets Jaire Alexander is going to get a great corner or something to that extent, right? But as he starts saying and then he cuts himself off, and that was the end of it. Maybe nothing, maybe something. But for me, it felt like Josh Jacobs was basically insinuating that Jaire was going to end up on another team, and whoever ends up with them is going to get a really great corner. Take it whatever way you want. I could totally be wrong on that. April 26th, the NFL draft concludes, and Micah Robinson was the only corner that the Packers selected through all 7 rounds. And of course, he was a 7th round pick. Then Brian Gutekunst talked at his post-draft press conference on Jaire Alexander and said, quote, "We'll work through that as we go, but no updates there. And he is on our roster right now, and that's how we'll proceed, but we'll figure that as we go along." And then he was asked to clarify, does that mean he's going to be a Packer? And he said, quote, "No, I'm just saying nothing's changed. No updates. We'll proceed as we go for now, and we'll see how it goes." So still non-committal. And that's where I did the 0.01% tweet, because I still very much believe at this point. And just to, again, I'm not trying to exonerate myself or anything, whatever. I don't need to go over it any more than I already have. I get it. It's a nothing, whatever. But up until this point, outside of that one that I mentioned where Goody said, basically, we'll see what happens in the draft and then kind of go from there. And you could argue maybe him working out with Xavier McKinney, him, welcoming or congratulating Nate Hobbs on becoming a Packer. There's a couple positive signs there, right? But every report locally, nationally, and just the logical thing based on the contract and everything up until that point would lead you to believe that Jaire Alexander was not going to be back with the team. And then we get the report from Tom Silverstein on the 26th that says, quote, "A source familiar with the dealings between the Packers and Alexander said the Packers still were in the market to trade him and were waiting to see if a team might have interest after the draft. There's no plan for the Packers to bring Alexander back after deciding in February they were moving on and then shipping him to teams. The Packers decided after Alexander missed more than 65% of the team's defensive snaps due to an injury for the 3rd time in 4 years, they were going to move on. At least one team was willing to trade for Alexander," a source said, "but Alexander was unwilling to restructure his contract or take a pay cut so he wouldn't be such a burden on the team's new cap. The Packers may have to cut Alexander and get nothing for him. Gutekunst has shown by keeping Alexander that he's determined to get something for him." That was on April 26th. April 28th, Schneidman, in his article, a new article from Schneidman, says, "Gutekunst and the Packers have to make a final decision at some point. With the draft behind them, it would appear logical for Alexander to remain on the team, but that hardly sounds inevitable when listening to the general manager." Then we get to April 29th. And April 29th was the first sign that something had changed. Rob Domofsky writes, he did a tweet first, but then wrote an article and said, quote, "There's still a chance Jaire Alexander will play for the Packers in 2025. What once appeared to be a certain breakup now could be headed towards a reconciliation. The source told ESPN on Tuesday that all options are still on the table: a release, trade, or a return. Both Alexander and the Packers had expressed frustration over the 2-time All-Pros past 2 seasons, during which he missed games because of injuries and a suspension." Our first glimpse that there could be a potential reconciliation between Jaire and the team on April 29th. On April 30th, Albert Breer in his mailbag on SI says, quote, "I would think at this point the most likely scenario is that he's back on a reduced contract that has incentives. We'll see." Then Josina Anderson on May 2nd tweets out, "I'm told there already is an understanding in place between the Packers and Jaire Alexander to come to an agreement on his roster and contract situation first, prior to an arrival for the team's offseason program, per league source. Alexander is not currently in attendance for the Packers' in-person workouts, per head coach Matt LaFleur. He reportedly participated in remote sessions last week. The Packers have had exploratory trade talks with other clubs involving Alexander. Releasing him is also an option. I've spoken to at least 2 teams monitoring Alexander's status for quite some time." On May 2nd, Matt LaFleur speaks and says, quote, "To be honest with you, I don't have many updates in regards to where we are in that whole situation. I just know we're trying to work through it." Matt did confirm that Jaire Alexander was not present for any in-person workouts. On May 7th, per a Jeremy Fowler article, Fowler stated, "The Packers passing on cornerback for the first 6 rounds seems to signify that Jaire Alexander is staying with the team. Barring a unique trade offer or a contractual stalemate, the Packers and Alexander are working on a resolution that should materialize soon. That was 23 days ago. A revised contract for Alexander, due $17.5 million in cash this year, to balance his injury history with his longtime status as an elite corner might be the most sensible play. Then on May 8th, we got Peter Schrager on the Pat McAfee show saying, I talked to Matt LaFleur during draft week, and he said they're in a good place with Jaire Alexander. The situation is a lot better than what has been presented in the media. There is a place for Jaire Alexander in Green Bay. Then on May 14th, Jeff Hafley is asked about the Jaire Alexander situation. And Jeff Hafley says, I think we'll leave that one up to see what happens rather than talking any hypotheticals to answer that fairly. Whenever everything pans out and we figure out who's here, we will do the very best we can to put them in great positions and making plays. When I find out, we'll do that. This is another interesting one because Jeff Hafley will talk about pretty much anything. Like, he's pretty much an open book. Like, he'll talk to you about what you ask. This is not a hypothetical. He's on the roster, right? So I know what Jeff's saying and like, hey, we don't even need to get into this, whatever. But the fact that he is still at this point saying like, I'm not dealing in hypotheticals, he's on the team. There's clearly, the insinuation here is that they're still working through this and trying to figure out if Jaire's going to be back on the team. And Jeff won't even talk about it in the instance of like, what if he is back on the team? So that was noteworthy. Then on May 14th, you get a Rob Demovsky article and saying, quote, Alexander's status remains in flux. Shortly after the season, it appeared both Alexander and the Packers wanted a fresh start, but when no trade offers to the Packers' liking materialized, discussions began about keeping the former two-time All-Pro who has missed more games, 20, than he has played, 14, over the past 2 seasons. And I think this is a really key piece here. After the season, it appeared both Alexander and the Packers wanted a fresh start, but when no trade offers to the Packers' liking materialized, discussions began about keeping the former All-Pro. That's sort of the piece here that's important. They were wanting to trade him. They were wanting to move on. Jaire was wanting to move on. They didn't get what they expected in return. And now you have to pivot and say, do we just move on and get nothing? Or do we try to make some sort of reconciliation here? And the Packers have clearly chosen the latter and trying to go for some form of reconciliation. Whether that works or not remains to be seen. On May 15th, Packers passing game coordinator Derek Ansley was asked about Jaire Alexander. He said, quote, we have contact every morning. So Derek Ansley still very much in contact with one and only Jaire Alexander. And then last but not least, May 27th, Matt Schneidman reports, quote, according to a source with knowledge of the situation, the Packers have proposed a restructured contract to Alexander, which tangibly demonstrates their interest in retaining the two-time All-Pro cornerback during an offseason in which they have been open to trading him. Alexander and his agent, John Thornton of Rock Nation, have not agreed to a restructuring yet. Alexander, who's 28, wants to remain in Green Bay and has 2 years remaining on a then record contract extension he signed in 2022 for $21 million annually. That is where things stand right now. We have no further updates. The Packers have not come to an agreement with Jaire. Jaire has not come to an agreement with the Packers, and this remains at a standstill as of recording this episode. The other note from Matt was that Jaire is going to show up to mandatory minicamps and even earlier. We'll see if that spurs some action. I'm telling you, I have no idea still where this heads up. If this ends up being where Jaire's back in Green Bay, totally believe that at this point. You told me they still ended up releasing or trading him, I would still totally believe that at this point. Clearly, a much better chance than what I had thought earlier in the year, what many had thought earlier in the year. And like I said, I would put it at a true coin flip at this point in time. Best case scenario. And again, Goody is just in a win-loss either way. If he brings him back and he's hurt right away, everyone hates Goody because what were you thinking? He was hurt for 4 years. Why did you not think he was going to get hurt again? Why did you give him a bunch of money again to come back and have him play and just get hurt all over again? If you bring him back and he's awesome and he plays, you look like a genius. That's the coin flip that you're taking. On the other end, if you let him go and he gets hurt right away, you're a genius. Way to not give him any additional money and have him go somewhere else and earn the money there. And now he gets hurt right away again. Smart move, Brian Gutekunst. Or they cut him or trade him, ends up on a team that is in the NFC, maybe even the NFC North if they release him. He goes on as an all-pro season. Goody's an idiot. What was he possibly thinking? Why would he have not brought him back? There's just, basically dumb luck at this point. There's no scouting that you can put into this. If you're being an analytically driven person or just kind of putting logic together, say, hey, if he was hurt for 4 seasons, probably going to be hurt again. But there's no guarantee of that. There's no science in that. They're just, looking at the trends. I don't know where else to go with this. As of right now, Jaire is still on the team. He's not been traded. He has not been released. And I have no idea where this turns next. We could get multiple twists and turns still, or maybe on this Friday, we get a Friday news dump and, Jaire Alexander's back or Jaire Alexander is gone and you move on one way or the other. It's going to be a very interesting final solution to this one way or the other. It'll be interesting to hear from Jaire one way or the other when this is all said and done, and maybe even fill in more of the gaps from what we know right now. That is going to do it for me today. A very interesting Jaire situation. Again, I will happily and gladly, admit that probably could have changed my stance on it a little bit and said, hey, it's probably like a 25% chance or something like that. I'll say it one more time. My thought at the time, and I think understandably so, was that I don't think there's any chance he's back, but I will never say never. And that was what I meant by the 0.01% is I'm not closing the door. There's always a chance. There's always a sliver. But at the time, I really did not think he was going to be back. Now, clearly, there is a much better chance of that. And again, I would put it at a true 50-50. Flip a coin, call it one way or the other. That's where I think things are at right now. There are times and moments where I feel like, yeah, he definitely seems like he's coming back. Others where I feel like he's definitely gone. Hopefully, we find out sooner rather than later. But that has not been the timeline that these two sides have been operating on. We could still have months before we get a final determination on this. That's going to do it again for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. Appreciate you kind of sticking with me through a long, meandering Jaire Alexander process. Shout out to our All-Pro and Hall of Fame members, Most Hated Minnesotan, PJ Wynn, John Wild, Brandon Paletta, Boom Handle, Donald Lee, Lori Lord, Baby QB, David McCluskey, Donald Decker, Alex Huang, Peter Ritaka, Jay Zimmerman, B. Brown, Puerto Rican Packer, Dan Gessford, Dylan Patscott, SoCal Pack, Chris Rager, Izzy Roberts, Ian Ewing, Jake Koner, Carlo Delgado, Willie Winkle-Stinkle, Jen Wright, The Gable Storm, Matt Geiger, and Pack Attack Cast. I'll see you guys tomorrow, but until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.